Every time someone touched him, he cried out in fear. A once beautiful German shepherd, broken by hands that should have protected him. No one could get close, until one woman stepped forward with something different: patience and love. What happened next will stay with you forever. The shelter was quiet that morning. A rare stillness hung in the air, interrupted only by the sound of distant barks and the occasional clang of a metal gate. In Kennel 14, a German shepherd lay pressed against the back corner of his run, unmoving, eyes open, but empty. His name, according to the intake form, was Max. He was 4 years old, large, lean, and visibly strong, but nothing about him seemed powerful. His coat, once likely thick and striking, was dull and patchy in places. His ears twitched at every sound, but he didn't move. Not until someone tried to touch him. Then he cried. Not a growl, not a bark, a cry. The kind of sound that made even the most seasoned volunteers freeze. A mix of fear, memory, and something no one could quite name. Some thought it was trauma. Others thought it was hopelessness. All they knew was that Max had been this way since the day he was found, tied to a post behind an abandoned farmhouse, with no food, no water, and no clue how long he'd been there. Attempts to interact with him were limited. Anyone who approached with a handout, no matter how slowly, was met with trembling, low whining, and finally, when contact was made, a high-pitched yelp, like he expected to be hit. Some stopped trying, until Claire arrived. Claire Owens was 36, a veterinary nurse who volunteered at the shelter twice a week. She wasn't loud, she wasn't forceful, she didn't come with an agenda or a savior complex. She just listened, watched, waited. The first time she saw Max, she didn't walk into the kennel. She sat across from it for over an hour. No phone, no notebook, just her presence. Max didn't react at first. He barely looked at her, but she kept coming back, always in the same clothes, always with the same soft energy. No sudden movements, no pressure. On the fourth visit, she noticed a shift. Max didn't tremble when she arrived. He didn't move toward her, but he didn't flinch either. Claire took it as permission. She began sitting closer to the kennel gate. Sometimes she'd hum softly. Nothing melodic, just low, calming tones. She brought chicken, not tossed into the pen, but placed gently on the ground just outside the bars. Max didn't eat while she was there, but the food disappeared when she left. On her sixth visit, she opened the kennel door, very slowly. Max remained still, his body tense. She didn't walk inside. She knelt just past the threshold and waited. 5 minutes. 10. 20. The shelter around her moved on. Other dogs barked. People came and went. She stayed. Finally, Max shifted, just slightly. His eyes flicked toward her. Then, his nose twitched. He took a single step forward. It wasn't much, but for a dog who cried at every touch, it was everything. Claire smiled and whispered, "Good boy." That was all. That night, the shelter manager reviewed the logs and saw Claire's entry. Max stepped forward today. No crying, no panic. First time he moved toward a human. It was progress, but no one could have predicted what would happen next, because the following morning, Claire returned with something in her hand that would either break the fragile trust they'd built or bring the first real light into Max's life. Claire arrived just after 8 a.m., same as always. Her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, soft denim jacket, and jeans worn thin at the knees. In her right hand, she held something new, a small pair of soft rubber gloves. She wasn't there to treat Max, but today she needed to know something important. Was Max afraid of hands or of human touch? She paused at the kennel, looking at him. Max was already awake, lying in his usual spot against the back wall. His ears flicked and his eyes slowly met hers. He didn't cry. He didn't move. But the fact that he looked at her and held that gaze for more than 2 seconds was something new. Claire sat down cross-legged, just outside the open kennel door. "Morning, Max," she said softly. She didn't enter. Not yet. Instead, she slipped on the gloves, slowly, deliberately, making sure the sound of the rubber stretching over her fingers didn't come off as threatening. Max's ears twitched, but he didn't bolt. That was her signal. She scooted forward just enough to place herself inside the kennel. Knees bent, gloves resting on her thighs. Max shifted slightly. He wasn't relaxed, but he wasn't panicking either. "Let's try something," she whispered. She didn't reach for him. She reached down, picked up a piece of shredded chicken breast from the small container she'd brought, and gently placed it on the ground between them. Then she slid her hand back to her lap. Max sniffed. His eyes darted from the food to her, then back to the food. Claire waited. After nearly 2 minutes, Max slowly got to his feet. It was the first time she'd seen him stand willingly, with someone inside his space. He took 3 hesitant steps forward, nose quivering, eyes never leaving the food. He stopped a foot away, then lowered his head and took it. He didn't cry. Claire smiled. Good boy. She didn't reach out, not yet, but she placed another piece on the ground, this time just a little closer to her. Max followed. He ate again. Still no sound, no fear response, no visible shaking. Her heart beat faster. She didn't want to ruin the moment, but she had to know. What would happen if she reached just a little closer? With her gloved hand, she picked up one final piece of chicken. Instead of placing it on the floor, she held it out in her open palm, just a few inches from her knee. Max looked at it, then at her, and then he stepped forward. Claire held her breath as his nose brushed against her hand. He hesitated, sniffed, then gently took the food from her fingers. She didn't move. He backed away a step, licking his lips. No cry, no flinch, just curiosity. For the first time, Claire dared to believe that Max might not just recover, but bond. She sat quietly with him for another 20 minutes. When it was time to leave, she stood slowly, removed her gloves, and whispered, "You did amazing." Max stayed where he was, his eyes calm, head slightly tilted, not in fear, but in interest. Outside the kennel, the shelter manager raised an eyebrow. "Did he let you touch him?" Claire shook her head. "No, but he took food from my hand. No panic. That's a win." He smiled. "You're the first person he's allowed that close." Claire looked back at the kennel. "He's not broken, he just needs time." But time wasn't guaranteed, because later that day, the shelter board would discuss Max's file, and what Claire didn't know yet was that Max had only 2 weeks left before he was scheduled to be transferred to a facility where dogs like him didn't get second chances. Claire returned to the shelter the next morning with more optimism than usual. After nearly 2 weeks of slow progress, Max had taken food from her hand. It wasn't just a small breakthrough, it was a lifeline. She felt it in her bones. This dog wanted to trust again. He just didn't know how yet. As she signed in at the front desk, the shelter manager, Marcus, called her over. "Hey, Claire, can we talk for a second?" She looked up, sensing something in his tone. "Of course. What's going on?" Marcus scratched the back of his neck. He was in his early 50s, kind-hearted, but worn down by the endless stream of difficult decisions. He gestured toward a stack of files on the desk behind him. "We had a board meeting last night," he said. Max came up. Claire's stomach tightened. Marcus continued. "They're worried. It's been almost a month. He still won't let anyone else near him. We're overcrowded, and he's taking up a kennel that could be used for dogs that are ready for adoption." Claire's voice cracked before she could stop it. "He's not a lost cause. I know that. You know that. But the board's looking at numbers, not progress." He sighed. "They've scheduled a transfer, 2 weeks from now." Claire froze. "Transfer where?" "To a behavioral rehab center upstate. It's not a bad place, but it's high volume. Dogs who don't make quick progress there are usually..." He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need him to. Her heart sank. Max, fragile, traumatized Max, wouldn't survive that place. Not emotionally, maybe not physically. The idea of him being handled by people without patience, thrown into a new environment, surrounded by barking, stress, noise. No, she wouldn't let it happen. "I want to file a foster request," she said quickly. "I'll take him. Home with me. Marcus blinked. Claire, are you sure? He still cries when people get near. He's not house-trained. He won't even let anyone leash him. I don't need a leash, she said. I just need time. Later that afternoon, Claire sat outside Max's kennel, more determined than ever. She didn't enter. She didn't rush. She simply laid out a thick folded blanket near the door, placed her hand down beside it, and waited. Max approached slowly. He sniffed the blanket, then her hand. His eyes were still cautious, but there was no shaking. She whispered, "You're running out of time, Max, and I won't let them take you, but you have to meet me halfway." She reached out, just enough to let her fingers graze the edge of his cheek. Max froze. For a second, Claire thought she had pushed too far. Then Max, slowly, hesitantly, closed his eyes and didn't cry. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Good boy," she whispered. That night, she began preparing her home. She lived in a small cottage outside town, quiet, with a fenced yard and no other pets. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful, safe. She bought a soft dog bed and placed it in the corner of the living room. She cleared space near the door and put a blanket that smelled like her there. She stocked up on gentle treats, rubber toys, and calming sprays. Max wouldn't just be a project, he would be family. Back at the shelter, Max lay on the same blanket Claire had brought him. It still held her scent. He closed his eyes slowly, not in fear, but in rest. But he had no idea what was coming. And neither did Claire, because just days before the transfer deadline, an unexpected visitor would arrive at the shelter, claiming to know who Max used to belong to, and demanding to see him again. The front desk phone rang at 11:17 a.m. Marcus answered, expecting another appointment cancellation or a question about adoption hours, but instead a gruff voice on the other end said something that made him sit up straight. "Yeah, I'm calling about a dog. German Shepherd, black and tan, name might be Max. 4 years old. I think he ended up there." Marcus asked the usual follow-ups. The man said he had lost the dog months ago. No microchip, no adoption paperwork, just a mix-up with the family, he claimed. When Marcus pressed him, the man's voice turned defensive. "I just want to see the damn dog. You people have had him long enough." Marcus didn't like the tone. He told the caller someone from the behavioral team would return his call. He didn't mention that Max had already been scheduled for transfer, or that Max was finally beginning to show signs of healing, but the call left a chill in the air. Claire arrived that afternoon, completely unaware. She brought a soft rope leash, not to use just yet, but to begin building familiarity. Max greeted her the same way he had the day before, cautious, curious, but calm. She knelt at the kennel door, held out her hand, and for the first time ever, Max leaned in and rested his head gently against her fingers. Her breath caught in her throat. "You're trusting me now, huh?" she whispered. He blinked slowly. She stayed for over an hour, speaking softly, letting him touch her hand, even brushing his shoulder gently with the back of her glove. Max didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. His body still tensed at times, but he stayed. It was more than progress. It was connection. Claire was about to leave when Marcus pulled her aside. "There was a call this morning," he said. Man claimed to be Max's previous owner. Claire's stomach dropped. "What did he say?" Said Max went missing, gave vague details, sounded off. Claire clenched her jaw. "Did you tell him anything?" "No. But if he shows up, legally, he might have a case. Max was found without ID or chip, and if he pushes it, we could be forced to release him." Claire looked toward Max's kennel. He was watching her, ears perked, tail low, but not tucked. "He can't go back to whoever did that to him," she said. "You've seen how he reacts to people. He wasn't just abandoned, he was hurt." Marcus nodded. "I agree, but we'll need proof." Claire thought for a moment. "Let me file the foster paperwork, today." "I'll get it started," Marcus said, "but be prepared. He might come in person." 2 days later, he did. A tall man in his late 40s, wearing a faded trucker cap, walked into the lobby. Thin frame, weathered face, a beer gut pressing against his flannel shirt. His boots left dust on the tile floor. He didn't look at the dogs, didn't ask for help. He went straight to the front desk and said, "I'm here for Max." Claire wasn't working that day, but Marcus was. He stepped forward. "Sir, can I ask what your relationship to Max is?" "He was mine. Got out a few months back. Saw online you got a shepherd that looks like him. Same age, same markings. Do you have proof of ownership?" The man scoffed. "Don't need papers to know my own dog." Marcus's voice stayed steady. "We'll need documentation, vet records, photos, anything." The man's face darkened. "Y'all acting like I abused him or something. We're just protecting the animal." The man stared at Marcus for a long time, then muttered, "I'll be back." Claire got the call that night. "They said he'll return," Marcus warned. "I've started the paperwork for emergency foster placement, but we're in a race now." Claire's heart pounded. "How many days until Max is transferred?" 4. Claire knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to wait. She was going to take Max out, into the real world, for the first time. A test to prove that he could leave the shelter safely, and that with her, he could finally start healing for real. Claire arrived at the shelter just after sunrise. The morning was quiet, the air still cool from the night before. She carried 2 things, a bag of Max's favorite shredded chicken, and a plan. She was done waiting. The paperwork for temporary foster placement had been submitted. Marcus was doing what he could behind the scenes, but Claire knew time was running out. The man who claimed to be Max's former owner might return any day now, and if he brought the right documents, or a lawyer, Max could be lost forever. She wouldn't let that happen. Today, she'd do something bold, something risky, but something Max needed. She entered the kennel slowly. Max looked up from his blanket, alert but not panicked. His ears twitched, tail resting low, not tucked, not rigid. It was the posture of a dog who was learning to trust. "Hey, buddy," Claire whispered. "You ready to try something new?" In her hand, she held the soft rope leash. Not like the nylon shelter ones he'd seen before, stiff and cold. This one was warm, worn in, and had her scent on it. She had kept it in her jacket pocket for days, letting it absorb her presence. She knelt beside him and laid the leash gently on the floor. Max sniffed it, then looked at her. "Good boy," she said. Just a short walk. No loud sounds, no rush. He didn't move, so she reached for the chicken. Piece by piece, she placed it along a path from his blanket to the kennel door. A slow, quiet breadcrumb trail of trust. Max followed. Not quickly, not confidently, but he followed. At the door, she paused and slipped the loop of the leash over his head. Not pulling it tight, just resting it there. He froze. Claire didn't move. She simply waited. After a long moment, Max exhaled, just a soft, quiet sigh, and took another step forward. And with that, he crossed the threshold. For the first time since his rescue, Max left the kennel. The hallway was silent. Marcus had cleared the path for them. No other dogs barking, no strangers, just Max, Claire, and the sound of soft paws on tile. Claire led him outside into the small, grassy courtyard behind the shelter. Max stopped. His eyes widened. Sunlight, air, space. He blinked fast, overwhelmed by the flood of sensations. His nose twitched furiously, ears moving in every direction. His tail hung frozen. Claire knelt beside him, keeping her body low, non-threatening. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're doing amazing." Max took a few steps forward, his movements stiff at first. Then, he lowered his nose and sniffed the grass. It was the first time he'd touched the earth freely since who knows when. Then, something unexpected happened. Max sat, not in fear, but in rest. His body relaxed slightly, his jaw unclenched, his eyes softened. And then, Claire reached out and placed her hand gently on his back. This time, he didn't flinch. He leaned into it. She felt the weight of him pressing slightly against her palm. The warmth, the trust. And suddenly, she was crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks as she whispered, "You're free now. You're safe. I promise." They stayed in the yard for nearly an hour. Max even laid down in the grass, his head resting beside her knee. She knew the fight wasn't over. The man could return. The board could still deny her, but this moment, this quiet hour under the sky, was real, and no one could take it from them. That night, Marcus called her. The board is reviewing your foster request tomorrow morning. They want a behavioral report, something concrete. Claire smiled through the phone. I've got everything they need. I'll prove to them what Max is capable of. But the next day, just before the meeting was set to begin, a fax came through the shelter's main office. It was a signed ownership claim, with photos, vet records, and a demand. The man wanted Max surrendered within 48 hours. The printed pages were still warm when Marcus handed them to Claire. She stood in the shelter office, fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the documents. There it was, a vet receipt from 2 years ago, a blurry photo of Max as a younger dog, and a signed letter from a mobile veterinary clinic listing the man, Eric Dalton, as the dog's original owner. He's forcing the issue, Marcus said quietly. Legally, this strengthens his claim. Claire looked up, eyes burning. You've seen Max. You know what he's been through. No photo or old vet bill changes that. I agree, but the board has to take it seriously. They've called a vote tomorrow morning. And if they side with him, Marcus exhaled, Max would be released into his custody by law. Claire's voice dropped. He won't survive that. You know he won't. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't need to. Claire drove home that night with her thoughts spinning. She barely noticed the roads. Her fingers clenched the steering wheel as if trying to hold on to Max with sheer force. At home, she reviewed everything. Every note, every photo she'd taken of Max's progress. She wrote a letter, 4 pages long, outlining everything from his physical trauma to his psychological scars. But she knew words weren't enough. She needed Max to speak for himself, and the only way he could do that was to show them. The next morning, Claire walked into the shelter's meeting room with Max at her side. No crate, no muzzle, just a leash and a quiet, cautious dog walking close to her left leg, head low, tail not wagging, but not tucked either. 4 board members sat at a long table, eyes wide as Max entered the room. One of them whispered, "Is that him?" Claire nodded. "This is Max." She handed in the documents, her letter, and then knelt beside Max, placing her hand gently on his back. "He was found tied to a post behind a condemned house," she began. "He was underweight, terrified, and cried whenever someone tried to touch him." Max shifted slightly beside her but didn't move away. In 3 weeks, he went from not allowing anyone within 5 feet to this. She looked up at the board. "This isn't just a rescue. This is recovery. And it's not done yet. If he goes back to that man, all of this," she motioned to Max's calm presence, "will be undone." One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with a clipboard in her lap, leaned forward. "Do you have any behavioral proof?" Claire took out her phone. "I filmed his first time in the yard, his first time resting, his first time being touched without crying." She played a short video. Max, lying on the grass, Claire's hand on his back, his eyes closed in peace. When the video ended, the room was silent. Finally, the lead board member spoke. "We'll deliberate. You'll have our decision by end of day." Claire spent the afternoon in the shelter's courtyard, pacing while Max laid beside her. At 4:57 p.m., Marcus walked out with a yellow envelope. Claire stood, her heart thudding. Marcus smiled softly. "You did it." Claire opened the letter with shaking hands. "The board has approved your emergency foster placement request. Effective immediately, Max is under your care until further ownership investigations are completed." She dropped to her knees and hugged Max gently, burying her face in his neck. He didn't pull away. He leaned in. But outside town, in a small rented house on a dirt road, Eric Dalton wasn't done. He'd received the board's decision too. And he wasn't just angry. He was about to show up and demand Max back himself. It was just past noon when the knock came. Claire had been sitting on the porch, Max lying beside her in the sun, his eyes half closed, head resting on her foot. For the first time, he looked normal, like a dog at peace. The knock shattered it. Claire stood slowly, her stomach turning. She didn't need to look through the window. She knew it was him. Eric Dalton stood at the front gate. Same flannel shirt, same boots, same entitled posture. But this time he wasn't holding papers. He was holding a leash. Claire stepped off the porch and walked to the gate. "I told the shelter I'd be coming," he said flatly. "I got their decision," she replied. "Max is legally under my foster care." "That's temporary," he snapped. "He's my dog." Claire's jaw tightened. "You didn't treat him like your dog. You left him tied to rot in the dark." He flinched when people breathed too loud. Eric stepped closer to the gate. "You don't know what you're talking about. That dog was trouble from the beginning. Never bonded, never obeyed. He bit my brother once. Had to be taught some discipline." Claire's hands balled into fists. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just opened the gate, stepping halfway out onto the gravel drive. "You don't get to call what you did discipline," Eric scoffed. "You think a few treats and cuddles fix a dog like that?" Claire's voice was calm, but cold. "No, but love, trust, and consistency do. Things you clearly never gave him." Eric looked past her. Max had stood up. He was watching from the porch, tail still, ears pricked, but he didn't cower. He didn't run. Eric pointed toward him. "He remembers me." Claire turned to look at Max. "Yeah, and that's exactly why you'll never get near him again." Eric stepped forward, but Claire blocked his path. "If you come near this property again, I'll file a restraining order. I have photos, videos, vet reports, and witness statements. If you want to go to court, I'll bring everything." There was a long silence. Then, finally, Eric sneered. "Not worth it." And he turned and walked away. That night, Max lay beside the fireplace, head in Claire's lap. He had stayed close to her all day, not with fear, but with loyalty. She ran her fingers through his thickening coat and whispered, "He's gone, Max. He won't hurt you again. Ever." He exhaled deeply and closed his eyes. 2 weeks later, the final papers arrived. Claire opened the envelope on her porch, sunlight warming her shoulders as Max dozed beside her. Certificate of Permanent Adoption. This document certifies that the dog formerly known as Max is now legally and permanently placed in the care of Claire Owens. She smiled down at him. "I think it's time for a new name." Max lifted his head as if he'd been listening the whole time. Claire paused, thinking. "Your past doesn't define you anymore." She scratched gently behind his ear. "How about brave?" His tail gave one quiet thump. Some dogs break because of what's done to them. Others survive and find someone who teaches them how to live again. Brave wasn't just rescued. He was rebuilt by patience, trust, and love. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes every dog deserves a second chance. Together, we can be the voice they need and the future they deserve.